This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Okay, well, thanks very much for attending. My name is Matthew Hill. I'm a lecturer here at the Institute for the Study of the Americas. It's a great privilege to introduce and launch Dr. Alex Mal's book on US foreign policy and the rogue state doctrine. The format of it, I'm going to shut up pretty quick and let the people talk about it. The format will be that Alex will talk and outline the argument of the book for about 15 to 20 minutes. And then Professor John Dumbrell will be talking, John Dumbrell from Durham will be talking, giving his wise words for 15 minutes. And then Professor Inderjeet Parmar from City University will also give his words. So without further ado, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, thank you for coming. A few minutes ago, I wasn't expecting to talk to anyone here, so it's good you spread yourselves out and made me feel welcome here. Thanks, Matthew, for that introduction and for suggesting the venue here for a book launch. It's particularly impressive. I've come to several events here, and it's an absolute kind of privilege to talk here finally as a speaker. Whether you think you've been sufficiently enlightened after what I've said is a different matter. What I can guarantee is that having John Dumbrell here and Inderjeet Parmar, you are going to get some very good insights into contemporary American foreign policy, and I thank them for coming along to today's event. It's enjoyable actually to get to this point where you're talking about the finished book and still holding out the expectation that it might be favourably reviewed. In terms of the idea for the book, John Dumbrell has to take some credit, as it was in his office many years ago when I was an MA student at Keele, that he suggested my dissertation on the Clinton administration's foreign policy could benefit from some focus on rogue states. From that point, a PhD was undertook, and now we're at the finished article. In that time, I've been fortunate enough to spend a substantial period of research leave in the United States at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, and been able to interview numerous Clinton and Bush officials to help me formulate the ideas that are contained within this book. As Matthew said, I'm not going to try and bore you by reducing the entirety of the book into this talk. In the main, because I think it would be more interesting to respond to what our two guests here have to say about it. I will outline the structure. I'll talk a little bit about the rogue state concept, and then highlight some of the key themes that I think are fairly noteworthy from the book. The book itself is focused really on the drivers and the impulses behind US policy and the reaction of America itself to the behaviour of the rogue states that it identified as a threat to national security. Rogue states aren't absent from literature on US foreign policy, but what writing there has been has tended to be quite narrowly focused on issues concerning international law, for instance, counter-proliferation strategies, and military strategy more generally. IR theorists have also looked at the rogue states issue, and really from a point of view of considering the degree to which rogueness as a kind of a concept exists, whether there really are genuinely rogue actors on the international stage. And they've also used it forward, in particular, a kind of constructivist kind of approach to understanding international affairs and American foreign policy. Where I come in really is very much from the viewpoint of the contemporary historian, trying to piece together a clear picture of the executive response to rogue states and the bureaucratic, domestic and international pressures on the development of the policies towards those states such as Iran, Iraq, North Korea and Libya. And I think by looking back at how this unfolded at the end of the Cold War, how it was carried on through the Clinton administration, through to George W. Bush, we get a better understanding of the contemporary challenges facing America and the courses of action that are open to Obama at the present moment. Although the book looks back at the Cold War history of US relations with the rogue states, its primary focus, I say, is on the post-Cold War era. And in doing so, I've identified kind of 4 key stages where I identified there was a political transition, or perhaps what we'd expect to be a major turning point in how America might approach the rogue states. The first and obvious moment is the end of the Cold War and the election of Clinton to the White House. And it's in this period that we see the rogue states doctrine emerge as a response both to justify US engagement on the world stage and to make sense, if you like, of a changed national security environment, the Kennan kind of sweepstakes, trying to identify the new sort of threats that are facing America. The second stage I identify as being of importance is a Republican takeover of Congress in the 1994 midterm elections. The period from 1995 to 2000 sees a concerted effort by the Republican Party to both manage the domestic and foreign policy agenda of the Clinton administration, and really to try and pressure, in terms of rogue states, the Clinton administration into the policy of regime change. Also during this period, Clinton is coming under heavy pressure from the Republican Congress to fast-track development of national missile defence on the basis of the character of these regimes and their reckless actions and undeterrable kind of nature. During this period, Clinton's buffeted by hardliners at home and unease from abroad at the very notion of the rogue state doctrine, the idea of labelling states in this way. And it's quite an interesting period where you see him tiptoeing between those competing pressures. The third stage really is the return of Republicans to the White House in George W. Bush. And I'll do a short chapter on the 8 months prior to 9/11, which looks at the expectation really that Bush would sign up to regime change and support the Republican Congress's hardline stance. And I kind of talk about how rhetorically that is perhaps so, but what we actually see is a great deal of consistency with the Clinton approach to the states in question, which perhaps says more about the limited means America has to change these states' behaviour than anything else. The final shift, which does see a decisive change in the Bush approach, is obviously 9/11, and this final chapter looks at how rogue states and then the axis of evil become central to the war on terror. There's detailed discussion of the march to war with Iraq and regime change there, but there's also consideration of the very varied approaches taken towards Iran, North Korea and Libya, which range from kind of bellicose rhetoric and threats of military force to pragmatic acceptance of the limits of US influence, sporadic engagement mixed with a heavy dose of isolation and containment of those states. They really went through the whole gauntlet, if you like, of policy options. With pretty much unsatisfactory results, I would say, as Iran and North Korea accelerate really their ballistic and nuclear programs during that period. I thought it'd be interesting, having just sort of gone through the structure there, to talk a little bit about where this concept of rogue states emerges from. And early on, I suppose it should be said that rogue states is the most common phrase used to identify a group of countries who are seen as a threat to American national security and that of regional allies. But they've gone under many other headings as well. Pariah states, renegade states, outlaw states, terrorist states, my favourite in the Reagan years, Looney Tunes states, and now with Obama, they're outlier states. But the rogue concept, the rogue state language continues to filter through many of those discussions. Second, the rogue states did not suddenly emerge on the international stage after the Cold War, despite the inference that I did by many commentators and I think by many policymakers as well. The notion of pariah states was, in the way I do it at least, first really traced back to the Carter years, and it was congressional focus initially on states who exhibited appalling levels of internal behaviour. So human rights abuses saw Uganda, Cambodia labelled beyond the pale of international actors. But by the end of the Carter administration, when we see the first state sponsors of terrorism list introduced, the focus really has gone on to external behaviour as identifying whether a state is a rogue or not. Policymakers will still talk about the internal makeup of these countries and human rights abuses, but the pursuit of chemical weapons, the support or sponsorship of terrorism, hostility to US and America's allies, and really, as the Cold War winds down, worrying signs of development of nuclear and WMD programs are the things that identify a state as a rogue. If we look back over the last couple of decades, policymakers actually have tended to be quite reluctant to provide an exact tick list, though, of what rogue membership entails. I think in part to avoid claims of political selectivity, which was faced by Clinton when he included Cuba on the list but excluded Syria, for instance, in the 1990s, resisted calling India and Pakistan rogue states after their nuclear showdown in the 1990s, and resisted efforts by Congress to label China a rogue state during that period as well. Essentially, a rogue is a rogue if America says it is. There's no standing for the concept in international law, and the wider international community as such has not readily embraced the term. The sort of major formulation of the rogue state doctrine occurs in the Clinton years. It's in an article in Foreign Affairs by Anthony Lake about backlash states, and he identified states incapable of adapting to a new world that showed defiant and aggressive behaviour, were recklessly pursuing weapons of mass destruction, offering support for international terrorism and promoting radical ideologies. And in that post-Cold War era, those states were Iran, Iraq, North Korea, Libya and Cuba for the Clinton administration. Why did America target these states, though? Overall, what kind of key things can we point to for why they become an important part of the narrative in the post-Cold War era? Well, I suppose a simple but no less convincing for that explanation is that all these states had at some point or another bloodied America's nose, damaging national and regional goals. We can see that with, say, the Cuban Revolution, the Iran hostage situation, Libya's acts of terrorism in the mid-1980s and so forth. Secondly, I guess in America, the rogues were exhibiting signs of destabilising behaviour. They were of concern in a post-Cold War era where nuclear and WMD proliferation were key concerns. Major American allies were threatened in important areas of the world: Israel, South Korea, Japan. And there were concerns about the destabilising effects of the Soviet collapse, the chance of nuclear material and know-how falling into the wrong hands, and the very fact that the loss of that superpower patronage could somehow set these rogue states on a reckless path. They would be freed of the restraints of the wider Cold War framework, and that was a worry to policymakers. Thirdly, it fits very much in with how America identifies threats to its national security. The idea of US exceptionalism. It falls to America to lead in identifying global threats. No one else can. Okay, that's the sense in which American policymakers are approaching this issue. It's also very much a means of justifying US engagement and activism. America in that essence, needs the other against which to define itself. They had the Soviet Union in the Cold War. When that was taken away, lots of literature about navigating without signposts and so forth, that you can identify what you stand for by what you stand against. The rogue states came in to fill that void left by the Soviet Union. And really, I suppose it was about preserving and extending US preeminence, containing and removing obstacles to the application of US power and influence, justifying American activism, and preventing the emergence of weapons states in regions of key importance. For the Clinton administration, as they introduced the idea of the rogue states doctrine in 1994, it was very much bound up with the wider goal of promoting internationalism and their strategy of engagement and enlargement. The rogue states were the realist flip side of the notion of the democratic peace. They were the bad guys who were incapable of change and stood in the way of that trend of democratization and the extension of the family of market economies. They were the grounds for America retaining their strong military and their presence, and this comes through in the public rhetoric of the Clinton administration. Their presence was a rejoinder to the neo-know-nothings who suggested America that could enjoy a peace dividend could somehow afford a period of retrenchment in international affairs. Arguably, as well, from the Clinton point of view, the rogue states doctrine, the emergence of the rogue states, was to offset heavy criticism, really, of their rudderless foreign policy at this period, in the wake of setbacks with Somalia and Haiti as well. I won't talk for too much longer, but I just thought I'd outline a few kind of key themes, a few sort of talking points that come through. And one of the first really is the difficulty of rehabilitating rogues, because that was the actual initial goal of the Clinton administration, was to rehabilitate these states into the community of nations. Well, that really was seen as requiring engagement, and that's a hard strategy to sell. It requires concerted presidential and bureaucratic activism and agreement across the various bodies responsible for the formulation of American foreign policy. Obama saw how difficult engagement was to sell after his 2008 campaign and his rhetoric about opening up to Iran and North Korea. Clinton faced it after signing the 1994 nuclear agreed framework with North Korea, as he lost the appetite to really see that agreement enforced, which would have encouraged greater diplomatic ties with North Korea, opening up of consulates and so forth. That came with too much political cost to follow through as a policy. Engagement is a very difficult thing to follow. It's a long, torturous path with no guarantee of success. And it's a process, I suppose, that doesn't really fit very neatly into the presidential cycle of office. For instance, the Libya deal, which came to fruition in 2003, was started way back in the kind of 1998, 1999 by the Clinton State Department. It took many years to get to that end point. Engagement as well requires a partner you can negotiate with. And I suppose on this issue, it may be easier to engage with a one-man band like Gaddafi than it is with the Iranian regime, where perhaps you're never sure who is quite talking for Iran and whether you're making progress with the right people. It also requires the support of regional allies who may have very different goals, very different concerns and ideas. South Korea, Japan in East Asia, Israel in the Middle East. Aligning all these actors at one time is, very problematic, very difficult. And presidents are likely to face real criticism for suggesting the possibility of negotiating with rogue states. How can they be trusted? Why are we propping up their regimes with aid and legitimacy through talks? They're undeterrable, bad to the bone. They will not stick to any agreement. they'll make a deal and then carry on with their rogue behaviour. That's really the sense of the 1990s and what was happening when Clinton, particularly after 1998, when he drops the rogue language, starts calling them states of concern, trying to open up to Iran, North Korea. Those are the kind of problems he faces in selling that approach, particularly on Capitol Hill. Engagers, quite often in shorthand, are labelled appeasers, and that's a major issue. And it's interesting that that tag was levelled at Bush as well after the Libya deal by conservative hardliners and after he removes North Korea from the state-sponsored terrorism list. So it worked both ways, really. Another key theme is domestic pressure that is brought to bear on the rogue states approach, and really is aligned to support punitive action against the rogue states. So things like the Israeli lobby, the Cuba lobby, the Pan Am families groups in the 1990s, all lobbying Congress for tough action against these rogue states and finding a Congress receptive to that. Sanctions are quite a simple, to a degree, easy way of showing you're doing something with little cost really for Congress itself. There aren't the same groups on the other side. There is one, I think, America Engage, representing some business groups who are saying that sanctions harm the American economy, but they don't have the same kind of presence as those other groups calling for punitive measures against rogue states. And Clinton faced this in the 1990s, this high level of domestic pressure, when Iraq, the goal of Iraq policy becomes regime changes mandated by Congress. Iranian opposition groups are given funding for covert kind of efforts to destabilise the Iranian regime, trying to force Clinton towards a regime change goal rather than that rehabilitation that was at the start of his ideas about rogue states. Finally, I suppose the language of rogue states can be both a hindrance and a benefit depending on goals. I think Clinton was very much painted into a corner by the language he introduced with rogue states. The concept was co-opted by the Republican Congress and taken a step further than he ever would have wanted. I say Clinton dropped the language eventually, I think 1998, to replace it with states of concern, but even within his own administration, that message didn't get through. The Pentagon continued to use the term rogue states to justify its own limited form of national missile defence. So it's difficult, once that language is out there, once that idea of rogue states is out there, to change people's ideas about it. And it can work in your favour. And I think 2003, the March to War with Iraq, is a clear idea where that was aided by concepts and the notion of badness, recklessness in the terms of rogue states, and worst case scenario thinking that had been associated with Iraq over a long period of time. Used consistently by Bush to justify intervention, to ward against inaction, and to rally against further inspections and sanctions. We had to tackle this rogue state to prevent a mushroom cloud over a US city. So a lot of the ideas, a lot of the language associated with rogue states used there to justify and sell, if you like, the invasion of Iraq. Finally, I suppose, before I hand over, it's clear that the rogue states problem has not gone away. The book ends really in 2004 at the end of the fallout from the Iraq invasion. It's clear that Clinton and Bush did not find an optimum strategy. In essence, the can was kicked down the line. Difficulties relegated, particularly with North Korea and Iran, to the too hard to solve box. And I think that sense of drift is most palpable in Bush's second term. And it now seems where we're past the point where either engagement or punitive sanctions can solve the problems with Pyongyang and Tehran's nuclear programs. Containment now seems the best of a bad bunch of options for America. How that is sold to the American public and Congress will be an interesting challenge for the Obama administration in their remaining years, because I don't think Obama can use that phrase, containment, otherwise he'll be seen as appeasing, really, Iran in that situation. I'll hand over.
Brilliant, thank you so much. John?
Start off. I'm absolutely delighted to be making this this response to Alex's book and his talk. I actually taught Alex as an undergraduate and as a postgraduate, so it makes me feel incredibly old to be. I am incredibly old. In fact, in 2002, I wrote an article called "Rogue States: The Clinton Doctrine." I kind of really argued about the notion of a doctrine. I mean, a doctrine is often described or thought of as sort of grand strategy or a statement of purpose or something, and one or two of them are a bit like that, such as the Truman Doctrine. But most doctrines, in fact, are quite narrowly conceived things, and often very much kind of warnings to enemies. And I thought that actually Rogue States was very much the Clinton Doctrine. It was a kind of a formulation which was kind of warning states to behave themselves. So that was my kind of contribution to it. But I was, as Alex says, present at the creation of this book. Also, a very important influence, I think, on Alex's work as it developed was Robert Litwack, his book, I think, Rogue States and US Foreign Policy, which was published actually in 2000. But that was very much a kind of policy-making book, and obviously it was entirely really about Clinton. And it argued very much that the notion of rogue states was distorting, and it didn't allow for flexibility and so on and so forth. Litwack, in fact, has got another book out, I think about a year ago, called Outlier States, which really is his book about the Obama administration. And I don't know if I have time to talk about Obama much, but essentially Litwack talks about the outlier concept really as being a development from rogue states, and actually a much better development, really. And he says, quote, "It is a calculated departure communicating to Iran and North Korea that there was a pathway for them to rejoin the community of nations if they came into compliance with international norms." So the idea of a rogue state is very ambiguous, as Alex has been saying, but it kind of does imply that these are irredeemable, that these are pariahs that you can't engage with at all. I know that's not necessarily what Clinton intended, but obviously Obama's trying to kind of get away from that. Alex, of course, takes the Clinton years and goes into the Bush administration, where very much the rogue states concept is used, I think, as a way of telling other states to behave themselves. I think Richard Pearl said that Bush's foreign policy can be summed up in two words: "You're next." The problem, of course, is that when you make a mess of invading Iraq, then your credibility in terms of your next absolutely disappears. So I'll just say a few words about who are the rogue states. Alex has got an excellent section where he talks about Lake's discussion of backlash states and kind of wonders why he put Cuba into it. I mean, Cuba doesn't seem to fit very well. Cuba was not developing WMD. Certainly in the 90s anyway, Cuba was not really sponsoring terrorism in a meaningful sense. In fact, Alex concludes the only real test of whether or not a nation should be a rogue or not is if policymakers in Washington say it is. So this, again, that kind of raises a prior question about, why did they say it is? Why did they pick out these particular states? And again, I'd be interested if Alex has got time to kind of, if you talk particularly about Lake, Alex has worked on Lake's papers. How did Lake's thinking develop? How was Lake a very, very sophisticated and intelligent cerebral kind of policymaker? How did he kind of light on these rather simplistic concepts? Also, to some extent, what role was played by Serbia and the Bosnian crisis in Lake's thinking? If you read Lake's books, are a bit kind of eccentric and not very straightforward, but he clearly does put enormous emphasis on Bosnia, after Vietnam anyway, as something structuring his thinking. And why wasn't Serbia a rogue state? I think perhaps I can guess why, but maybe if Alex maybe could take up some of those questions, it would be interesting. Rogue states seem to be, of course, they have to be states. I mean, they can't be transnational Al-Qaeda type movements, and also they're clearly not failed states either. Somalia doesn't fit into this either. They have to be kind of containable. You have to kind of be able to deal with them, I guess. They shouldn't, I think, from Washington's point of view, have a great power sponsor, because you're getting in trouble if you start demonising states which have a very powerful friend. But of course, again, you think about North Korea. I mean, North Korea has, of course, got a very, very powerful ally, very tense relationship with China. I appreciate, but so again, it's actually quite difficult to think of boxes or criteria which you can say were rogue states. They should have a security. They should present a security threat to the United States. But again, Cuba does Cuba present a security threat to the United States in the 1990s? The answer really is no. And also, of course, there's the whole question, which Alex goes into great detail about, that domestic pressures. Maybe we're talking about, really domestic pressures being responded to in this sort of list of bad guys. There's also interesting points to be made about the link with human rights, really. And as Alex shows, I think in the first chapter, actually this concept of rogue states has its roots, rather surprisingly, in Jimmy Carter's human rights policy and in the State Department's annual register of human rights practices, which kind of morphed into a register of terroristic or state-sponsored terrorism. But again, clearly, if you're looking at human rights records, I mean, most of the rogue states have got absolutely terrible human rights records, obviously, but they're not all, some are worse than others. I mean, again, Cuba probably, frankly, is not as bad as most of the others on the list, and of course, many states with absolutely awful human rights records don't get on the list at all. So it's quite interesting about omissions from the various lists of rogue states and pariahs and outliers and all the rest of it. It's interesting there's not any African countries really at all. Why is that? Again, we can think of reasons, but it's quite interesting that there isn't any. What about Serbia? Does Serbia seem to have a possible protector in Russia? It doesn't kind of fit really because it's so explosive, perhaps in the 90s. More recently, you might think, obviously Syria is the big one that's missing in the 90s. Why wasn't Syria put on the list? I guess, again, perhaps it's to do with Russia. And also, you might see Venezuela in more recent times under Chavez, Saudi Arabia possibly, given his role in terrorism, but again, we all know why that's not on the list. Interesting, Vietnam, really. It's very, very interesting in the 90s that the United States actually finds it easier to embrace Vietnam and to come to normalisation of Vietnam, a country, after all, which had defeated it in a major conflict, than it does to come to terms with Cuba. So again, these are just questions of, again, I appreciate there's no point in trying to say why isn't it consistent, because as Alex says, it's just, it happens to be what policymakers say are rogue states, but nevertheless, can we tease out any kind of consistency at all? I'll just talk for 5 minutes about the kind of general way of thinking that surrounds rogue states, which we might call sort of binary thinking. Us and them, bad guys and good guys, sort of thinking. Alex does try to locate this in the kind of American culture and history and so on, talking, for example, about American sense of uniqueness, the belief that it is best placed to identify and judge other states. And clearly, the concept of rogue states takes on, as Alex just hinted at, a kind of teleological aspect. In other words, rogue states, particularly in Lake's formulation of it, are the states sort of backing history. They're the states refusing, almost willfully, like a sort of naughty child, to go along with history, to go along with the logic of marketised and democratic expansion in the post-Cold War era. So essentially, I think that is there anything that can be said for thinking in these terms? I mean, I guess if you asked some policymakers what sense does it make to think in terms of bad guys and guys outside the pale, I suppose you might get a response to the effect that, well, you have to clarify things, that there's a danger that policymakers face of being sort of paralysed by complexity, something after which Obama has been accused of. If you're aware of so much information coming in, there's a danger you get swamped by it, you become absolutely incapable of action because of the complexity of things coming into you. You need heuristic, or you need cognitive tools to kind of make sense of all this. Now, clearly Reagan would be like an extreme example of somebody who took that logic, and I think, I'm not sure if Alex exposed this or not, but there was a famous quotation from Reagan, and he says that too often Americans are shushed like little children, and told that there are no simple answers to complex problems. And Reagan said there are simple answers, but maybe you do need an element of ignorance or an element of creative simplification, perhaps, to act at all. So But anyway, I mean, clearly, I would suggest that binary thinking, as Litwack said in that book so many years ago, doesn't really help very much. And if I could just read for a couple of seconds a piece from this is Anatole Levin writing in the current New York Review of Books. He says, quote, he's talking about, this actually is an article about Afghanistan, but he's talking about American history and Vietnam and so on. He says, quote, during the US debate, to give it that name, that preceded the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I was appalled by the extent to which the Vietnam experience had been forgotten. Not so much lessons about the nature of guerrilla war and its horrors as about the United States itself. These include the dangers of demonising the enemy of the moment, on the basis of a belief that any enemy of the United States must be inevitably evil. Not only does this tendency make pragmatic compromises with opponents much more difficult and much more embarrassing, should they eventually have to be reached, but consciously or unconsciously it allows the US government and media to blind the US public, and often themselves, to the evils of America's own allies, whether it's Karzai or whether it's South Vietnam. So clearly there's something in that. However, I'm actually kind of a bit reluctant to say, to kind of situate binary thinking in this kind of American cultural context. Clearly, I think for one thing, it kind of reeks too much of a sort of first-year introductory course to American culture, and with more, Puritan sort of moral categories and exceptionalism and frontier mythology and so on. After all, I think actually binary thinking is, okay, it's an American characteristic. Actually, it's a characteristic of most people, to be honest. Just that, if you think about American thinking, actually matters a bit more because America's so powerful and other countries aren't. And actually, I think to some extent, Europeans have got binary thinking because they project to America these qualities of being rather simplistic and tending to think in terms of bad guys and good guys. Again, I can't help but thinking we're not too lucky after the funeral of Mrs. Thatcher, and one of us and them. These things are not necessarily entirely American, but those are things which we can think about. There's one other thought. I thought in terms of binary thinking and the book and its arguments. Alex puts great stress on the domestic roots of a lot of these things, the Cuban lobbies he mentioned, and so on. How far really do concepts developed in order to fulfill purposes of domestic mobilisation and domestic answering of pressures? How far do these concepts actually distort foreign policy when they become adopted? And I wonder, for example, again, just to take one example actually, which Alex uses, it is to do with Bill Clinton and his desire to deflect what was widely seen as a kind of new populism or isolationism in the early 1990s, so that they kind of rogue states. You might think there's no problems in the world anymore, but you've got to believe there are some bad guys out there. We need to have high defence budgets and a fairly internationalist foreign policy to combat them. To what extent does this kind of distort the Clinton policy? And after all, I think looking back on it in the early 1990s, you'd have to say, if you like, the threat, inverted commas, of a kind of Pat Buchanan or new isolationism, or Ross Perot or something, but he wasn't really that great. More importantly, perhaps, I think it's worth perhaps raising the issue, maybe, to what extent with the Bush administration, to what extent were they the victim as well as the perpetrators of rather crude binary thinking? You might say they developed crude binary thinking to mobilise domestic support and also to send messages to enemies, you're next. But did they become the victim of that as well? I think it's quite an interesting point. A very, very last point, just to talk for literally under 2 minutes, about Obama and the kind of outliers. I think this is quite interesting. To what extent do we think that Obama has transcended the problems of rogue states thinking? There is a literature which is very critical of Obama, obviously, particularly thinking about Iran and North Korea, and clearly on the right he's kind of criticised for being an appeaser. There's some crazy sort of books about Obama as somebody who hates America and that kind of thing. But there's also people who say that actually his approach to North Korea and to Iran is too rigid. In fact, there's a book by Trita Parsi called A Single Roll of the Dice, which criticises Obama for not being sufficiently receptive to noises coming out of Tehran, let's say in 2010 or so, particularly with Brazil and Turkey got involved. I mean, is that fair or not? I mean, my own kind of feeling is that actually Obama did try to, reach out and offer an olive branch, but he was actually kicked in the teeth. And I think maybe you could argue really that, in a sense, Obama was guilty not so much of naivety, but to some extent of cynicism. I mean, did Obama seriously expect Iran to embrace the olive branch or to make positive responses, given the fact that the Iranian government kind of defines itself really in opposition to virtually anything America does? So, and surely that must have been the intelligence that Obama was getting. So maybe the outreach was largely for symbolic purposes, domestic purposes to some extent, purposes of trying to establish kind of moral high ground to some extent internationally. I think those are quite interesting questions. But I guess simply my last question to Alex is simply, to what extent is this concept of an outlier, as I think Litwack argues, is this an improvement on the rogue states idea?
Brilliant, thank you.
Thank you. That was interesting and sort of broadens out the discussion as well. Now, Alex has, I think, written a terrific book, and I really enjoyed reading it and found out a lot of things that I did not know. So I'm really grateful for you writing it. And it's a great topic as well. It's a topic which has got a lot of controversy surrounding it, and it's a good way in to kind of look at some of the fundamental principles of American foreign policy making and the way in which the United States defines itself and defines others and so on. So it's a terrific way into those kind of big debates. And I guess really when you look at rogue states and the pariah states and others as well, they sort of emerge at the same time, or they emerge as very significant concepts at the same time as others, such as failing states, ungoverned spaces, or vacuums and so on, in which terrorism and other kind of disorders can develop. And mainly during the period in the immediate aftermath of the end of the Cold War. And that's the same period in which I think probably a larger umbrella concept becomes very significant as well, and that is the whole idea of the democratic peace. And the democratic peace seems to be the one big umbrella under which many of these concepts come, but it divides the world, if you like, into zones of peace or zones of democracy. And in democracies, generally speaking, there are broadly pacific or peaceful political processes, and that they also don't generally engage in wars with one another. But the undemocratic or the anti-democratic states are the ones which are normally designated in some way or other with a kind of negative label of either rogue or failing or being not so well governed. So, and Alex, you do look at the democratic peace, and you do look at that at certain points in the book, and I think that's useful to have that connection. Now, the book is incredibly detailed and very richly researched, and you looked at a vast number of online sort of archival material from the White House, from various speeches, from the State Department, from the Pentagon. It's a very, very thorough book. In fact, I would say of the books I've read in the last couple of years, that's not that many, but it's a few. I think it's a model of a book, because its coherence is striking. You start with a concept and you follow it all the way through, from the Carter administration all the way through subsequent administrations, and right up with the end with the Obama administration. And so in that regard, you get a kind of good idea about the kind of origins and the development and the whole processes through which the rogue state concept becomes so significant and important in American foreign policy. So, and I think your book, therefore, given the depth of the research you've carried out, I think it's authoritative. It will be a work of reference in this area that people will have to go to, because you trace the way in which this concept becomes so significant, particularly in the Clinton administration, but also before that. So, in that regard, your historical skills and your contemporary historian training has served you really well, and I think it will serve those who read this book very well as well. And you then also try to sort of, you fill gaps, if you like, in the literature, I think, in a very good way. You also as a good contemporary historian, also see the political processes outside of the executive, which are significant in the way in which this rogue state concept, if you like, could get out of control. And in particular, you look at 1994 and the defeat in the midterms of the Clinton administration of the Democratic Party, and the rise of the contract, was it contract with America or on America? Against America. But it was the rise of the Republican right, and the way in which that sort of, the idea was that the rogue state concept should now have real teeth, that America ought to go after more coercively than before all these kinds of North Korea and other states as well. So you look at that too, so that's a very useful thing. And as I say, you bring it up to the 2008 election of Barack Obama, and to the point of where his speech is extending the hand of friendship on American terms to various of these so-called rogue states. So I think what I would say the greatest strength of the book is that you focus on how a particular process, a particular idea arises, and how it actually manages to percolate its way up through discourses into key debates, and then effectively as a doctrine, and has remained something which, with its own kind of twists and turns, fundamental in American foreign policy, right through to the present. I mean, if Obama has changed the language to something like outlier, and then outlier suggests deviant, suggests abnormal, suggests outside of the mainstream. So it's a more subtle way of calling somebody a deviant or a rogue, but you're still calling them something, a state that doesn't fit the norm, and therefore deviants normally are to be subject to various kinds of sanctions or various kinds of stigma or excommunication from the sort of other forums of leadership and the community of nations. Now, where you do go into causes, you broadly invoke the kind of things that John was just talking about. You talk about ideas about American exceptionalism, which is that kind of bifurcation of the world into the good and the bad and the ugly and so on, and the right and wrong. Then you also mention American leadership, or the desire for hegemony, as a kind of another sort of strand in that kind of thinking. You also talk about threats to American security. And elsewhere you then also add to that the necessity of an enemy or a threat in order to sell to the public a much more kind of an expansionist or activist foreign policy itself. Now I'm going to say a little bit more about this, because I think there's in my own mind there are a few questions that it'd be good if, since the author is here, good for you to address, and it'd be interesting to engage in some discussion of this. But overall, I would say the book is a very strong, and it's an excellent addition to what has now become a very good series, which John Dumbrell and I co-edit for Routledge in the Routledge Studies in US Foreign Policy, which was born only 7 years ago and has already spawned 19 children, which is not bad. But we have got a whole series of very, very good monographs, edited collections, both hardback and paperback, covering, there are 2 books on Cuba. There's a book on the Middle East, there's a couple of books on the Middle East, in fact, on West Africa, and there's also a number of different theoretical traditions which are involved in the series. So if there are budding authors on the United States foreign policy, then we're very willing to entertain proposals and so on from you. But it's an excellent addition to that, and I think it's the 19th volume in that particular series. But as I say, everybody who writes a book, fantastic, and this is a really good book, and I would recommend that you read it and you sort of see what a well-constructed book it is. But every book does set an agenda or raise some questions, legitimate questions for other scholars, because other people have other conceptions. So I'm not a historian, so there's my first apology. I'm surrounded by historians, although, what are you? You're a good man, good man. I come from a kind of political science tradition, and there's a lot more role for theory in that particular discipline. And I think I tend to approach questions utilising some of those kind of frameworks almost before I look at some of the empirical material. There are issues and problems with that. I know historians have many problems with that. I tend to think it's more of an advantage, but that's not everybody's cup of tea. But I think one of the greatest strength of your book is you show how a particular process got to where it, from obscurity right the way through to the kind of national security agenda, and has had big impacts on resource allocations, decision making, and sort of the public discourse. And that's one of the greatest strengths of it. I think I suspect you need to answer some questions is why you don't really engage in such in-depth analysis of causes. And one thing you do sort of you basically marginalize as not necessary, and that's something you're not going to do, is you overtly say you are not going to look at theories. And it seems to me, I think that by closing that door, I think you do possibly lose some advantages, because I think you suggest effectively that there is no use for theory in explaining certain kinds of outcomes. And I thought that was probably an omission. And I'd like to know exactly why, in some greater depth, why you think that and why you did that in your book. And you can slag me off afterwards if you like. But it strikes me that theory has some utility, not a theory, but theoretical frameworks, and often rival theoretical frameworks. They suggest a range of questions which you might not otherwise have thought of. They suggest ways in which you might see reality, a particular kind of reality, or see other dimensions in a reality, and other kind of causal factors in a reality as well. And it seems to me that it's probably not possible to be atheoretical and objective in looking at the empirical evidence. And it seems to me that you are making decisions about what's significant, what's really important in a particular historical context, and you're making them without overt challenging of the assumptions that you may be holding. And I think very often what happens is that when one doesn't have a theoretical framework or a series of theoretical lenses through which one can look at a problem, you can often fall into the trap of using conventional wisdom. Effectively, it's what's in the air at the time that you're writing. What are the dominant ways of thinking about something? And I think that can then, if you like, implicate itself in the way in which you actually analyse the empirical evidence. So it's not that you don't have a theory, is you don't have an overt theory, but there are organising principles and significance of certain facts over others, and approaches to the topic which you might not otherwise have taken had you looked at a wider range of approaches to it. So I think there's an issue there with not having a particular theory. And I think one of the things probably that you could have benefited from in analysing this particular kind of episode or this process is really looking at kind of the way in which American elite self-concepts and the benign character of them operate. You use the language of America very often in your book. You talk about American security, you talk about national interests, you talk about American leadership or American hegemony. And I think if you need to interrogate that label, America, because America is not an undifferentiated polity, it's not an undifferentiated social or economic structure, and it's not an undifferentiated system in which everyone has equal levels of power or political influence. There are some groups which have great power, and there are other groups who have far less power. Therefore, if you look at the system in that particular way, that as a system in which there are political and other inequalities which are reflected in the processes by which decisions are made, ideas are adopted, some ideas become more or less significant, I think then you get to sort of looking at the way in which actual power might work in practice. So that then I think you might then begin to see that actually that the United States policy-making process is not necessarily as democratic as it sounds when you use terms like American national security or American leadership or American exceptionalism for that matter. Because who has the power to mobilize language most effectively such that it becomes the dominant way in which thinking about a particular topic takes place. Not everybody has access to the institutions and the instruments and of power of the media and so on. There are some groups of people who have far greater access to those, and it's their labels which tend to get the most airtime and therefore stick most readily, and thereby shape discourses, shape agendas, and marginalise other ways in which things may actually have been seen. So I would say the term national interest really needs to be interrogated, and I think in a way some of your empirical work suggests how you would have been able to utilise that kind of interrogation to quite good effect in your book. So for example, you talk about in the early part of the period after the Cold War, you talk about the demand for a peace dividend, the rise in neo-isolationism, the desire for more pacifism in American foreign policy as opposed to the continuation of a kind of globally active policy based around the rationale of the Soviet threat. And once the Soviet threat collapses, then there is a legitimate question that people ask on left and right and across the board, which is, once that threat is gone, should the United States not withdraw back to its kind of closer to its own frontiers and not be extended right around the globe? And if you like, you raise that issue within various kind of elite institutions or organisations and individuals, but also further down within the trade union movement and the labour movement and across the kind of organisations which reflect various racial minority interests as well, that they wanted a greater focus on the United States, on the society, the economy, on the educational system, on healthcare, and that kind of thing. So you did open up empirically, you recognise that there was not a kind of an agreement at the end, a consensus as to what America would do. And you do raise the whole idea of the confusion that reigns for several years until certain concepts are kind of honed in on. So I think if you would kind of develop that a little more, I think a theoretical frame which looked at the idea of elite power and so on, I think might have drawn your attention to how you might have, in a way, been able to kind of better understand that sort of confusion straight after the end of the Cold War. Now, carrying on with this theoretical obsession that I have, I just want to talk about pluralism a bit. Because I think actually you do have a theory of the way in which power actually works in the United States, but you don't call it by a name, theory. But I think your theory is effectively pluralism. You talk about the key elements of the political system in regard to the rogue state doctrine and how they operated around that rogue state doctrine. Your argument effectively was the executive kind of stands for America, American national interests, security threats and so on, or trying to attempt to deal with those security threats. And then you talk about other elements of the political system in a little bit, in some depth. You look at the Republican Party, you look at lobby groups, or you mention a range of sort of pluralistic actors which then have some influence in trying to hijack a concept and turn it into a far more aggressive, coercive mechanism than it had been intended perhaps by the Clinton administration. But in effect, what you are really talking about is a kind of pluralistic order. That fits right in with the whole idea of some kind of umbrella set of interests which unify, within which there are some key debates, but those debates are broadly narrow. That is, they focus in on tactical disagreements about the timing, about the means by which you should overcome a particular issue, threat or problem. So on the rogue state issue, if you look at it in that sort of pluralistic way, then it's a discussion and a debate between some lobbies and parties which stand on a more coercive element of the political system and those who stand on the slightly less coercive part of that political system. But you're effectively defining, or your conception of the political system is basically kind of broadly what is the kind of dominant way in which the system is explained. You look at any American government introductory text, that's the way in which it's laid out, how the executive works, how bureaucratic politics works, then how other kinds of electoral politics, then how kind of lobby politics and so on. So I think there would have been utility in utilising that theory to contrast with pluralistic kinds of theory. And I think that might have yielded some interesting benefits from the book, as well as dealing with the whole idea of why, not just how did a process lead to rogue state doctrine becoming so central, but also why, what are the underlying kind of elite interests which might have led to that kind of an outcome. I'd just like to take up a couple of other points. You talk about the notion of the other as one of the kind of there's a certain point in the book where you kind of go through a certain kind of list of kind of causal factors, but you don't systematically deal with causal factors, but you do mention the notion of the other, that necessity of the other in American foreign policy. In order to cohere it, you definitely do stress. And I think, to me, this raises a couple of interesting issues as well, and this goes back to the idea about the national interest as well. Who has the power to define the other? Who has the power to define and make a label, and make a label stick, such that it becomes a kind of a potent and politically salient label, and not just another thing that somebody said? And that really, that again leads to kind of something about the shortcomings of a democratic process in which elites have undue or far greater power than other forces do. Now, the other thing is the implication of using something like the other as a causal explanation. That is, it suggests that it's not just security threats at all that are driving American foreign policy, but it's the designation of random others as a justification for something which is inherent within American foreign policy. That is, a kind of expansionism which rests at its heart. That is, designating another and having a kind of inconsistent set of others suggests more about the United States than it necessarily does about those so-called others or those who are labelled others. It may say less about their behaviour and their otherness than about your ability or your desire to do something you want, and you are applying a label in order to justify it. So that the onus then is taken away from the reaction of America to the other, as you do say in your own book, that this is a reaction of the United States to this other. But actually then it puts the onus on the United States more, as in, you need to understand what that country and that state and that society and that elite are about. And perhaps the other is much more peripheral to the whole process of understanding that policy. That leads me on to a related point, that is the kind of the US centrism of your approach. Now, you stress that your focus is America's reaction to the behaviour of rogue states, and that's a perfectly legitimate, so I'm not arguing that you shouldn't have done it, you did it, it's your book, that's fine. But it does raise some issues though, and I think those are legitimate to raise here. And I think it has its own pitfalls if you have a US-centric approach which looks at America's reactions. The reaction suggests it's a secondary phenomenon, and the primary phenomenon is that which others are doing out there, and therefore the reaction is something which is caused by somebody else. Yet you basically say this is a study of the United States foreign policy, that you're not going to look at the impacts of that policy outside of the United States. So you are, on the one hand, you are adopting an American-centric approach, as in you're looking at America in its own terms. On the other hand, you're saying that the cause of that behaviour is reactive. The cause of the behaviour lies outside of it. And I think then that there's a kind of one or two sort of issues with that particular approach. And I think the main issue I would take with that is it fails to really be America-centric enough. That you tend to see this reaction to somebody else, but you're only looking at the reaction of it. And I think you need possibly to ask the why question as well in regard to the United States. Now, I think you'd also, when you have your idea about America, I think you tend to look at the sort of the political class or the political elite much more. And you also you effectively set them up, when you see them in their own terms, you also seem to imbibe some of their kind of outlook as well. So that when there are reactions from below, from kind of public opinion or certain segments of public opinion about the peace dividend and the kind of idea that America ought not to be so activist, you sort of accept, I think you cite Tony Lake as saying, that if we were to issue a 300-page document about what the complexity of the world out there, the American people wouldn't be able to understand it. That Americans think in these sort of binary terms, and therefore the message has to be in those binary terms. So again, what you do is you look at that particular elite in its own terms, and effectively the public opinion seems to become a threat to that, and something to which that elite has to react, as opposed to having a causal reason for manipulating or engineering a kind of public opinion which serves that particular kind of an interest. So I think there's a few questions I have written, and I stayed awake while reading it, I stayed alive and alert while reading it, and it's a really stimulating book. So it's a really strong addition to the literature. I think in its own terms, I think you do exactly what you set out to do, and you do it very, very well. But I think there are these sort of broader questions that I would raise, and it'd be interesting to see how you respond to this.
Right, okay, so if we can open it up to the floor and do some questions, and we'll take one at a time. So, Tom, please.
It sounds very interesting. I had to miss the very beginning, so if you gave a really elaborate answer to this question in the first 5-10 minutes, I apologise in advance. And one sort of thing that strikes me is on the sort of boundaries of this, in that you seem to imply that Serbia is not quite a rogue state, but then if you look at US policy, like US in the 1990s did not invade Iran, it did not take part of Iranian territory away, it did not bomb Tehran. It strikes me, if one actually looks at US actions and doesn't focus too much on returns, the US actually treats Serbia much more as a rogue state, and in terms of challenges to US authority, than North Korea say, it would seem to fit less. And if you went further back, you could perhaps look at apartheid South Africa in terms of sanctions in the 1980s. Secondly, it strikes me that there are perhaps difficulties, which is why I mentioned Serbia and South Africa. But in both Serbia, in the Serbian case, Congress was much more reluctant to take action than was the president. In both Serbia and South Africa, the Democratic Party and Liberals were by and large more supportive of action against them. So that potentially strikes me, in terms of the thesis you were sort of outlining, it strikes me that far from being trapped, quite often on some of these states, Clinton was restrained. He couldn't go as far, it was difficult for him to go as far as he wanted to because of congressional opposition.
Okay, yeah, I mean, very good points. I think it picks up on what John was saying as well about Serbia and its kind of omission from the rogue state list to start with, despite it taking up a considerable amount of the administration's time. On that issue, I think the key thing about the rogue state membership and category is they did not want to be constantly adding to it. They wanted it to be a short, manageable, catch-all list that had an effect on the imagination when you use the term, I suppose. And if you start bringing other nations into it, there's perhaps a dilution of that idea. And, as I said right at the start, other countries were consisting. Sudan was one that was, put on there in terms of fulfilled the criteria of terrorism, but perhaps not weapons of mass destruction. And talked about Pakistan and India, China. The Congress, was saying, well, that's a rogue state, but it geographically was too big. These tend to be quite small sort of states that end up on the list. So I think conceptually they wanted it to be a closed list, really, from the starting point, because it fitted in with their overall strategy of engagement and enlargement. This fits into kind of the witch's brew, if you like, of the Clinton administration in terms of how they approach the use of force as well, I think, and for what reasons, and humanitarian intervention, and so on. And that's how arguments about Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, they all unfold within that prism, and that's part of the reason for such muddle, if you like, as things are going on. And it's something else I'm doing at the moment, but arguably I'd say it's when Lake ends up taking a strong position on that and some of those issues about when America should use force that we start to see actually a more coherent American policy coming through. I mean, in terms of intervention in the 90s, a lot of that is bound up in European politics as well, and in terms of where America should be intervening globally as well. I mean, it did a lot to say, well, this is Europe's problem, something Europe should be dealing with. And, as I remember it, John might know more, be able to add more. I think the Republicans were arguing at that point quite heavily for lifting the arms embargo and for some kind of more robust approach, but one that necessarily didn't carry many risks for them, but carried many more for the administration, that they might get dragged in somehow into a drawn-out ground war, I suppose. So there are a multitude of voices, I suppose, at that time, which I think partly what was being talked about there showed some of the confusion about what America should be doing globally in the post-Cold War era.
I'm sorry, I think I may not have been as clear as I should be. I think those are very good points to what I was asking, but doesn't the fact that doesn't it show the limits of rogue status terminology, that in the 1990s the US military's biggest attacks aren't on rogue states, they're on states that aren't on that list? Like, doesn't it show the limits to which that actually shows US policy priority? Do you sort of see what I'm saying? That Iran and North Korea don't suffer anything like the Kosovo War. And that is quite partisan, like in Congress. Like Bosnia, it's a much more complicated debate. But if you look at the votes in Congress, it's like Libya, like virtually all Republicans, 90% of Republicans are against, and 90% of Democrats are for. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to look at the rogue states policy in terms of, what it's trying to achieve in terms of regional influence as well, and what are the most important regions of the world, and the Middle East and Asia at that point, and North Korea and Iran are focal points. I mean, as I say, with Iraq, there is fairly punitive action against the Saddam Hussein regime throughout the 1990s, after the uncovering of the assassination plot against George H.W. Bush. We saw the sort of cruise missile attacks. We see heavy bombardments of Iraq at various points. So there are actions and consequences for rogue states. I guess the consequences of using military force are much greater with the rogue states, which is why they aren't used so much. And the fallout of a long, drawn-out war with Iran's strong sort of capabilities in terms of ground forces. North Korea seems to have maybe one bomb around 1994. The fact that if America strikes against those states, there's no guarantees they will take out the very things which they are most worried about. So I suppose in a way some of these issues were more doable than others. So.
And it's also said that Cuba and Libya weren't exactly left alone. Well, Cuba's an embargo.
Oh, sure, but that is in a way.
Yeah, but you can't just sort of say, oh, sure. That's pretty bad. It has big impacts on their economy.
Sure, but they don't invade and annex and take over parts of Cuba the way they do in Serbia.
Well, one time.
Yeah, but that's pre-existing thing dating back decades. Like, there isn't a.
Yes. Jonathan Cullen from Westminster University. Thanks for the talk today. Thinking about the constructivist theory about how states create their images, their perceptions at the international level, I was interested in how the rogue state theory gives the US a justification internationally when perhaps there's a bit of a crisis of democracy domestically. We certainly saw in Florida in 2000, and under the presidency of George W. Bush, the reputation of America suffers greatly. How is the rogue state theory useful to politicians in this respect, to project an image of an ethical foreign policy abroad, combating human rights abuses and evil dictators with weapons of mass destruction.
Yeah, I mean, as I said at the start, kind of the human rights abuses angle, I suppose, in terms of sort of that ethical argument, is low down the list of priorities. It's always there in the rhetoric, it's always there behind it, but that isn't the thing America's most concerned about. I think, as John suggested, the list would be much, much longer in terms of rogue status if we were just focusing on human rights. You know, there's a fairly strong checklist you have to tick off and so forth. You know, with the George W. Bush administration, we have a lot more of the idea of the gut instinct foreign policy, which does talk more at a kind of a moral level about the character of these regimes and the reasons why they need to be targeted. In terms of kind of identity, and as you'll be very clear, I am not coming at this from an IR or particularly theoretical kind of framework. But I think the importance of the rogue states is in some ways in giving something to galvanise the public around. And, you know, I talk about in the book about the confusion at the end of the Cold War, the kind of sense of rudderlessness in kind of American foreign policy, the fact that foreign affairs, foreign policy, you know, every week there's a different argument for what should be the basis of American foreign policy. The administration, Clinton administration, get completely caught up in that with the what's called the Kennan sweepstakes, as they try and build up that idea that will capture the moment, will give them some kind of bumper sticker foreign policy. And I think in a way, capturing what John was earlier saying, it's almost strange that someone like Anthony Lake and a lot of the people who are in the Democratic administration of Bill Clinton, with their background in Vietnam, actually sort of latch on to something like rogue states and don't emphasise perhaps as much the human rights angle of the policy, and don't make human rights perhaps a central part of the national security agenda, I guess, in that way, especially when they're coming through from the Carter administration. Lake was Director of Policy Planning in the Carter administration, you know, a big influence on Cyrus Vance, sort of Secretary of State in that administration, who himself was, you know, very heavily responsible for the human rights policy. So I think that's an interesting point, why we don't see more of that moral argument put forward about rogue states in the Clinton years. I do think you see more of it after 2000, after 2001 with Bush. I'm afraid I'm not best placed to talk about, you know, constructivism and so forth and how that is, but I don't know if you have.
I think the Clinton people were extremely reluctant to be seen as Carter too. You know, anything but Carter sort of thing. You know, George Bush was anything but Clinton. Clinton was anything but Carter. You know, so.
I think what's interesting though, the kind of the framework that you were saying about rogue states, something that you mentioned which I thought was really interesting and it's in your book, is that you talk about how democracy promotion is the kind of the flip side of rogue states, in the sense that you've got the rogue states, so you've got the baddies out there, and that's the analysis and the framework of understanding the world, and this is the solution. And so in a way, actually your arguments of the democracy promotion, then the benefits from democracy promotion, the kind of the values that are inherent, that are kind of automatically kind of interwoven with the idea of democracy, is perhaps where you get that construction of an identity which the US is out there, you know, doing its crusade to promote democracy around the world and sitting upon the hill. So in a way, perhaps it's like the question should be addressing the democracy promotion part as perhaps the rogue state part of the element. Yeah,
definitely. You know, there's sort of it's a way of beefing it up in a sense, and of showing that there are genuine threats and showing why it's important to fight for it and its extension of market democracies and the democratic peace. And I think suggesting this isn't something that will just unfold without our real focus and dedication to the cause. We need to be strong, we need to stay strong, we need to challenge and target these states if we want that to capture the moment and to gain traction in terms of democratic enlargement. So I think it's very much bound up within that.
Do we have any? Please.
Apologies if you dealt with this before I came late. I'm just wondering if this doctrine makes allowances for the possibility that being labeled a rogue state is precisely what some of these rogue leaders are looking for. Thinking in particular of Kim in North Korea at the moment. It seems to me that he's being provocative precisely because he sees being labeled an enemy of America a badge of honor that gives him status at home. And I can't help worrying and wondering if the policy of responding to that kind of provocation is counterproductive. I'm thinking most recently of Barack Obama's statement that he's drawn a line in the sand with Syria with chemical weapons, because it seems to me that you give Assad a certain status at home in having that sword over his head and having that enemy of America status that actually galvanizes public opinion in the rogue state, that brings in recruits to support the regime.
Yeah, I mean, with rogue states, a lot of red lines have been drawn and allowed to pass. I mean, in particular, I think of North Korea post-2001 in the martial law of Iraq. The bigger problem with North Korea was allowed to, very oddly in some ways, pass by without, dedicated focus and the capture of that. But I think you're absolutely right. The rogue states language, policies associated with the punitive sanctions, the embargoes, the threats of military action. They're a way to show as a president that you are reacting strongly, taking this issue seriously, responding to Congress, or it might be Congress doing it in terms of the sanctions. But you are, in effect, whereas you're mobilising your domestic audiences, having the same effect on the domestic, well, let's not stretch out. It's being used in the same way by the rogue states leaders to rally support for the regime, to show the great Satan, if you like, and to show the clear threat that emerges out there and why the sacrifices are worth it. We need to keep going because we need the ultimate security against America and so forth. And I mean, that's an interesting thing now, been looking at that, Iran and North Korea might have taken from the Libyan revolution and the fall of Gaddafi is that actually these guarantees of regime survival, which in a way was what George W. Bush gave in 2004 in order to give up chemical weapons of mass destruction, aren't actually worth very much. So what have we got to gain by actually dealing with the United States? The only thing that will ensure our ultimate security perhaps is nuclear weapons, although I think arguably Iran doesn't want to go as far as saying it has or will have a nuclear weapon, but the sense that it's on the brink of one actually works quite well for the regime, I think. So.
Well, just the Obama people actually talk about something called strategic patience, which means that they won't be tempted to insult states in the way they actually want to be insulted. You think of Obama's reaction to the election controversies in Iran, for example. So I mean, the Obama administration is certainly aware of that. Whether they take enough note of it, I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think apart from Kerry, perhaps, I remember some statements there, I think the Obama administration dealt fairly well with the North Korea situation in terms of allowing it to just kind of, retreat from that. It was very heightened tension. I was invited on the radio to talk about, are we on the brink of something here? And I sort of said, well, I don't think we are. And you look back to 1994, I think that was a genuine, real, flashpoint, potential flashpoint. I've talked to members of the Clinton team, who say they were, pushing Clinton very much towards a military option at that moment. And there wasn't that same sense of that taking place in the corridors of power, I don't think, in Washington at that stage. And they wanted to, quickly take the sting, if you like, even though perhaps they were provocative with, certain exercises. But North Korea is looking, I think, for provocation at every kind of possible opportunity for that very reason I think you talk about.
We had UCL's version of this last Wednesday. Bruce Cummings, he's the historian of the Korean War, and also he's continued his studies, many years after that as well. And I think one of the things he mentioned there was the rationality of appearing irrational. And I think his view is that North Korea knows that if you sound like a lunatic, people are going to back off because they don't quite know that you won't do what you threaten to do. And the other thing, of course, is, it responds to various provocations as well. The United States was carrying out all kinds of military exercises right there, and I think some people in Seoul had mentioned that they could put a cruise missile through any window in North Korea. So there's a sort of the heat was being ramped up, and so North Korea not a retiring state. They're going to come out and be rationally irrational, and then the temperature goes down again because.
It's got a Richard Nixon madman theory.
Yeah, the madman theory. I think that's the apply.
I think what rogue, engaging with rogue states needs a lot of things to be lined up for it to have any chance of success, and one of those is your regional allies, and the fact they might have very different goals and maybe a different electoral cycle to that of the president and so forth, which plays into domestic politics. And I think perhaps you saw some of that with the Korean crisis as well, in terms of the rhetoric coming out from Seoul, which has an impact on the US and its position there. So I think it works both ways there.
Do you have one final question, Tom?
And a very interesting book and discussion instead. I was wondering how much you think the use of the term rogue state does actually trap as we heard earlier, the US is perhaps the wrong term, but US policymakers. What's the alternative term? It doesn't sound like rogue suggests you can be non-rogue. It sounds to me a lot less dangerous than talking about Stalinist states or Islamist states. It's a much vaguer term. And when you look at the kind of language that was used for places like China, and there's still able to be massive U-turns in policy, it strikes me as at least as strong. And I was thinking, you've referred to this a lot yourself, the classic example of that is Libya. That to what degree is the language trapping them as opposed to the inability to have a compromise? If the mad dog can be brought in from the cold, I just don't see why you couldn't bring in the Iranian regime or the North Korean regime. Do you sort of see what I'm saying? I'm sort of challenging slightly the degree to which they're trapped by their own rhetoric on this. That if they could actually do a deal, it strikes me it could easily stick. But
and certainly
they might not do one.
And we see that with North Korea in 1994, the agreed framework. You see efforts to engage the Iranian regime, after '98. I think it does have an effect, and I think that effect is shown by the fact that the State Department reins the language back in '98 and drops rogue states as a policy term. It says it's a policy of tutelage and so forth, rather than having any real benefits in capturing those states or changing their behaviour. And they introduce a new term, states of concern, which when I talked to Anthony Lake, he said it was the most sort of wimpish kind of phrase he'd come across. I think what it does is it can be, and this is where I think, in terms of Clinton, their idea of rogue states, I think there was some idea of the idea that they could be brought back in, because rehabilitating them, which again I suppose plays to American arrogance, but that they can somehow be changed and they're not beyond the pale, if you like. But I don't think that's ever picked up and thought through how that might happen, and instead what we get is punitive sanctions led by Congress, in particular against Iran and Libya. And what I think you see is that the rogue states language is kind of like a bone thrown to the Republican Congress, and it's picked up and taken in different ways. And I think it does bring up the connotations of recklessness, undeterrable, bad to the bone, if you like. And I think it then makes it very difficult when you try to change course, or when you do want to try and engage these states. I think you face much more domestic criticism and heat than you would have if the phrase hadn't been out there in the first place. I think it does send you, it does cause some fairly high political costs, if you like. Now, I think the Clinton administration saw its benefits from a mobilisation point, offset that, and that was perhaps based on the fact that they didn't think they could do much to change these states anyway, so there wasn't much problem having the rogue language and concept out there. But certainly when they wanted to respond to changes within Iran and changes with North Korea as we have the Sunshine Agreement, the opening up of North Korea, Pyongyang and Seoul and so forth. You know, I think that was when it became difficult, that it was harder to respond because of the characteristics that had grown up around the rogue state idea.
How does Libya fit into that?
Well, Libya is actually, throughout the 1990s, going down a very different path. I mean, it's actually very much within the United Nations. It's the sanctions regime is through that. Now, it's always the goal of the Clinton administration to get them to accept full responsibility for Pan Am and to satisfy the requirements of the United Nations sanctions in order for any engagement to take place with that regime publicly. Behind the scenes, the State Department is making secret overtures to Libya, I think throughout 1999 into 2000, but they see themselves as being limited in what those talks can achieve because of the hostility that there would be in Congress to any deal when the issue of the Pan Am bombing is still outstanding and the UN sanctions haven't run their course. So Libya is going on there in the background. It really kind of comes through much more in the Bush administration, but the groundwork is laid by Clinton, but really primarily after rogue states languages dropped in 1998, although I wouldn't necessarily associate the two together in that way.
On that final note, thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. I think it's been a stimulating conversation, and I'm intending to continue this afterwards when we've got coffee and cake, I think. So please, if you could all